attacks on the country. CENTCOM says the service member died attempting a controlled detonation of an Iranian drone from those strikes. 2 U.S. soldiers were also killed in Jordan on Friday after these attacks on the base there. A third is missing. CENTCOM says unidentified remains have been found at the location of the strike. If verified, that would mean 4 U.S. soldiers would have been killed in Iranian attacks on Saturday. Now, there's growing alarm as civilian targets are hit in Iran as well as the broader Gulf region. Kuwait's foreign ministry has condemned an Iranian strike on one of its water desalination plants. It's called it a violation of international law. Jordan has summoned Iran's envoy. Amman says 3 Iranian missiles were intercepted earlier on Sunday. The International Energy Agency says it's investigating reports that a U.S. airstrike hit a partly built nuclear facility in southern Iran. The IAEA atomic watchdog is warning about the serious risk of attacking near nuclear sites. The U.S. has also launched further attacks on Iran's Qasem Island in the Strait of Hormuz. Washington claims Tehran has missiles based there. And America has also targeted bridges and railway facilities, as well as an airport in southern Iran. Washington and Tehran are fighting for control over the Strait of Hormuz, and with no sign that the exchange of fire is going to stop anytime soon, hopes for diplomacy are fading. Now, Tokir Asadi is in Tehran. Mohammed Val is in Doha for all the regional reaction. First, we're going to go to Washington and Heidi Jo Castro. Heidi, what more are we hearing from CENTCOM?
Well, Rob, they released a statement that in northern Iraq there has been 1 more U.S. soldier death. This occurred on Saturday, and according to CENTCOM, this is as U.S. forces were trying to dispose of a downed Iranian drone, an ordnance, and a controlled detonation. Another service person was injured in that same operation. In addition, another set of human remains have been discovered, this in Jordan, where 1 U.S. soldier went missing on Friday after an Iranian attack there, in addition to 2 others who were killed in action in that same attack. So if you add all those numbers up in the 2-3 days since this escalation between U.S. and Iranian forces, this is at least 3, if not 4, once those remains are identified, U.S. soldiers who have been casualties killed in this war. Meanwhile, the escalation continues to ramp up, with CENTCOM saying that earlier today it struck IRGC forces who were responsible for the attack on U.S. soldiers in Jordan, as well as surveillance and air defense systems in Iran. Meanwhile, President Trump has not publicly spoken about this latest announcement of U.S. soldier deaths. He's actually at the World Cup final match in New Jersey, while, of course, the armed forces that he commands are still seeking this retribution.
And the question is, of course, how Washington is going to be seeing what happens next. The president may well be at the Football World Cup final. At the same time, decisions have to be made somewhere. Do we have any indication from the White House that the U.S. may escalate even further, or is there a chance that it is open to more diplomacy?
Right. Well, we're getting conflicting signals here. Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Defense Secretary, said that this only stiffens our resolve for the military. And Trump earlier had said that if Iran does not continue with negotiations, that the U.S. would then target all of Iran's power plants and all of its bridges. Well, we're seeing more and more of these attacks on Iran, though the U.S. hasn't taken credit for any destruction of civilian infrastructure. So it's still very a mixed picture here where this is going, but it does not appear that this is moving anyone closer to negotiations.
Heidi, thanks very much. Heidi Jo Castro in Washington, D.C. We're going to go to Mohammed Val, who is live for us here in Doha. Iran continuing to attack its Gulf neighbors. What's been happening?
Yeah, throughout the day there have been strikes in 3 countries, Jordan, Bahrain and Kuwait. In Jordan, authorities there are talking about 4 missiles launched from Iran. 3 of them were intercepted and 1 fell in an open area. Jordan condemning that action, of course, and Jordan has seen several strikes over the last few days, including those you mentioned that caused the death of some American soldiers. So quite an escalation there. And also in Bahrain, sirens were sounded and reports of some activity, some attacks from Iran without giving any specifics during the last few hours. But in Kuwait, Iran itself says it has targeted two American locations, American controlled locations, including a large arms depot and an air defense radar system. The Kuwait itself did not confirm that, but instead it's talking about civilian facilities being hit. Of course, we know about that water salination plant that was struck twice by Iranians, and that's a subject of huge anger in Kuwait and across the region.
And let's just focus on the desalination plants particularly, because they are crucial, of course, to supplying drinking water to a lot of the Gulf nations. How worried do you think the Gulf states are about the fact that these particular plants are being targeted?
Well, obviously, it's seen in the region as the ultimate threat, because that's the number one most vital thing here in the Gulf region, a desert region with very little drinkable water, except those amounts that are desalinated from the sea. So that's a very strong threat there from Iran. And Iran mentioned this even in March when U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to strike at civilian facilities in Iran, including water pumping stations. And Iran made that threat, and now we are seeing both sides putting it to execution. The Americans, according to Iranian reports, striking at civilian facilities, vital civilian facilities in the country, and we have seen this attack on a Kuwaiti water desalination plant. This could be the beginning of something more sinister here in the region. The countries are bracing, in the Gulf region, are bracing for this threat, and it is not an easy situation if it happens on a wider scale. You can't even imagine what's going to happen if Iran is able to destroy water salination plants across the Gulf region, a situation that everybody here is trying to prevent through diplomacy and a lot of pressure on both sides to try to return to the negotiation table.
Mohammed, just as you're talking to us, there's a line that's come out from the Reuters news agency quoting the Interior Ministry of Bahrain, saying that sirens are sounding in Bahrain at the moment. We're going to find out more about what's happening there. But for now, Mohammed Val in Doha, thank you very much. Tawqir Asadi is joining us now from Tehran. We understand that Iraq's Prime Minister is going to be making a visit to Tehran. Is there much optimism, given the fact that there's a lot of speculation about whether or not there's any sort of diplomatic contact going on between anyone at the moment? Is there much optimism that Iraq's Prime Minister might be able to carry a message from the US government to Tehran, given the fact he was in the US not that long ago?
There is optimism, but not much optimism, basically because of the fact that we know that despite all these diplomatic efforts on the way by Qataris, by Pakistanis and other regional countries to actually de-escalate the situation, we know that at this point, situation remains uncertain. Speaking of the forthcoming visit, which is, according to Iraqi sources, scheduled to take place on Thursday, we know that this is for the first time that the Iraqi Prime Minister pays a visit to Tehran. Again, according to the official sources, the discussions are going to be revolving around the bilateral relations, as well as some memorandum of understandings to be signed to improve the ties between Iraq and Iran. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, this is critically important, seeing the context. Iraqi Prime Minister was in the United States, and then he is paying a visit to Iran. And again, sources are saying that next is going to pay a visit to Turkey. And all in all, we have to keep in mind that the current situation is going to be a key point of concern, as the Iraqi sources again are saying that Iraq's attempts to put an end to this confrontation is part and parcel of that deal. But it's still, speaking of a message, we know that Iraqi foreign minister came out to say that in this particular trip, the Iraqi side is not going to bring any particular message or any particular statement or something like that to Iran, but still it goes without saying that seeing the actually the fact that he was already in Washington, part and parcel of the positions that he had received there from the American side is going to be out to be discussed when it comes to this trip that we are expecting to take place on Thursday.
Todd, I was mentioning earlier that apparently the International Energy Agency says it's investigating reports that there has been a U.S. airstrike which has hit a partly built nuclear facility in southern Iran. I understand that's the Drakhovan power plant. Has anything come out from the Iranian government about that?
Yes, indeed. First, it was the Atomic Energy Organization of the country coming out to condemn this attack and calling the facility as a symbol of Iran's self-sufficiency. And also, most recently, we've got the Deputy Foreign Minister of the country, Kazem Gharibabadi, coming out to put it on his X account to say that the American attack on this infrastructure, which was under construction indeed in Dar Khuwain, is a dangerous actually course of action to the peaceful infrastructure of the country. And he also continued to say that the responsibility for this attack, the insecurity and lack of actually security and the stability caused by this course of action goes to the United States government. And also he mentioned that Iran condemns this attack and says that it's going to take necessary actions in response. Also, we know that this is not just for the first time that Iran is witnessing attacks on its nuclear facilities over the course of past two wars, the 40-day war and also the war back in June. One of the most several most important nuclear facilities, including in Natanz, in Fordo, in Isfahan, and elsewhere, were heavily targeted, heavily damaged, and also it resulted in a sort of change when it comes to Iran's relations with the UN nuclear watchdog IAEA. And right now, inspections when it comes to Iran's nuclear facilities is something like a big question. Iranians are not that much positive about that. They are actually casting doubts about the impartial behavior of the UN nuclear watchdog, and we have to keep waiting to see whether Iran is going to practically formulate any response into that particular attack or not.
Tawhid Asadi talking to us there from Tehran. Tawhid, thank you very much indeed. We're going to take a look at the main issues between Washington and Tehran. Just to remind ourselves, the latest escalation began over shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran wants full control. The U.S. says the strait must remain free from any single country's control. Another major sticking point is Iran's nuclear program. Washington wants stricter limits on uranium enrichment and stockpiles. Tehran insists on its right to a civilian nuclear program. And the U.S. is also pushing for limits on Iran's ballistic missile program, saying it poses a threat to regional security. Well, Tehran says it's essential for its national defense. Now, Henry Insha is a former U.S. ambassador. He's also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. He's joining us live now from San Diego. So thank you very much indeed for being with us, Mr. Ambassador. I want to ask you, first of all, about the diplomatic efforts or lack of them that we've been seeing. At the same time, as we've just been talking about, Iraq's Prime Minister, who was in the U.S. just recently, is now making a journey towards Tehran. Apparently, they're going to be signing memorandums of understanding and plans going forward. What do you read into the fact that even though both sides, both the U.S. and Iran, say they're not talking to each other, nevertheless, there is this intermediary, for want of a better phrase, this visit that is happening at this time?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And look, really just a good question there. Look, I got to say, of course, there's diplomacy going on. Of course, there's intermediaries talking to each other and to the parties. And honestly, I find it inconceivable that the Prime Minister of Iraq, who's just been in Washington, would go to Tehran and really not say a word about the current situation, especially when his country is, of course, taking fire from Iran on a pretty regular basis. You pointed out that at least one American was killed there just recently in Iraq. So plenty for him to do. And he also has the opportunity, I think, to be a good mediator because, after all, he too is a businessman, like the U.S. president, like Donald Trump. So something different than the usual diplomat. So a real possibility there, in addition to all the other efforts. Look, if we can go back, if you don't mind for a second, back to the MOU. I heard you say very clearly that the U.S. is now insisting that it should be, the Strait should be free of any one state's control. Well, the Americans failed to get that point into the MOU. In fact, the MOU makes clear that Iran has an official role. So what we're seeing here is the U.S. trying desperately to get back to the status quo ante, the situation before the war. Whereas on the other hand, the Iranians had some control over the Strait. They were making money, and then they had to fire a shot, and now they're not making any money. So I think we have two countries that are trying to come back from significant errors.
On that basis, I mean, how does either side de-escalate and still claim it as a win, given the fact, as you've just pointed out, the MOU by both sides has been declared essentially dead. It's null and void. And because part of the problem, of course, was because the wording itself was so vague that it allowed Iran to, shall we say, interpret it in such a way that's to give it a greater control over the Strait.
Yeah. So look, if both sides really want to climb down and find a way back to a ceasefire, let's say, that can be done. The problem with the MOU is not so much the very poor drafting. The real problem is that there's a lack of commitment from both sides. It's not clear to me that Iran, or at least parts of the Iranian regime, want peace. I think there's a possibility that they see the war as a unifying factor and as something to justify the survival of their own regime. So they may want to continue the war. I don't exclude the possibility that Donald Trump sees some political benefits in continuing the war. And certainly he is hearing that from Prime Minister Netanyahu. So plenty of cross-cutting pressures both ways, most importantly among the American public when it comes to the effect on the economy, and most especially the very high visibility price of gasoline. Everybody can see that every day, and people don't like it when the number goes up.
When we had the original conflict just several months ago, there was a big push amongst the Gulf nations on both sides to try to de-escalate this situation. There is a constant question about how much pressure the Gulf nations are able to bring, particularly on the Trump administration, in order to change its strategy with regard to Iran. In your assessment, given that we're now in a situation where we're going through a second round of conflict, and again Gulf nations are being targeted, targeted by Iran. What else can the Gulf nations do, do you think, to bring pressure on either side to try to take the heat out of this?
Well, I think when it comes to Iran and the Gulf nations' relationship with them, unfortunately for them, I think it's mostly carrots, not sticks. And I think they can say to the Iranians that they're prepared, to radically increase the amount of economic interchange. I think they could say that they are prepared to accept some Iranian role in cooperation with other states on the Strait of Hormuz. I can imagine, on the other hand, that the Gulf states could look to China, right, in much more positive and diverse ways as a way of pressuring the United States. The fact is that, unfortunately for the Gulf states, they are caught between, two gigantic powers, one very, very close to them with which they share geography, and one which is far away and therefore hard to influence directly. Although, honestly, I am concerned that, the Iranians might find a way or make an attempt to take retaliatory action inside the U.S., and then we would have a whole different situation.
We really appreciate you giving us the benefit of your time, Mr. Ambassador. Henry Ensher, former U.S. Ambassador, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. So thank you very much indeed.